Hey guys, welcome back to Atlas Archives, where we uncover the captivating stories behind every corner of our world. Tonight we're journeying to Hungary, a landlocked country that somehow managed to run a respectable navy for centuries, because apparently maritime logic is optional when you're determined enough. Nestled in the heart of Europe like a comfortable armchair in the Carpathian Basin, Hungary has been home to Roman legions, Magyar horsemen, medieval kings, and more revolutions than a political science textbook could reasonably handle. Tonight we'll wander through Hungary's remarkable landscapes and equally remarkable history. From the endless horizons of the Great Hungarian Plain to the thermal baths of Budapest, from the crown of St. Stephen to the quiet genius of a people who gave us everything from the ballpoint pen to some of the most beautifully complex mathematics the human mind has devised. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something wonderfully connective about sharing these historical journeys across time zones. And if you find these gentle explorations through history help ease your evening, subscribe so you never miss our nightly deep dives into the world's most fascinating places. Now, get comfortable as we settle into Hungary's extraordinary story. Chapter 1: Introduction and Geographic Overview. Hungary sits in the Carpathian Basin like a comfortable armchair in the middle of a very busy European living room. It's landlocked, which means no beaches for the Hungarians, but they've made up for it with some of the most impressive thermal baths in the world. Imagine telling your friends you're going to Hungary for the hot springs. It sounds like the beginning of either a very relaxing vacation or a really elaborate excuse to avoid doing yard work. The country covers about 93,000 square kilometers, making it roughly the size of Indiana. If Indiana had been through a few more wars and developed a serious appreciation for paprika. Hungary is bordered by 7 countries, which is quite the social circle. Austria to the west, Slovakia to the north, Ukraine to the northeast, Romania to the east and southeast, Serbia to the south, Croatia to the southwest, and Slovenia to the west. It's like being the house in the neighborhood where everyone drops by. Except some of these neighbors have historically had keys and didn't always ask before letting themselves in. The landscape of Hungary is dominated by the Great Hungarian Plain, known locally as the Alfold. This vast expanse of flat terrain covers more than half the country and is so flat that locals joke you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. The Great Plain stretches endlessly under big skies, punctuated by the occasional small hill that Hungarians optimistically call mountains. It's the kind of landscape that makes you appreciate why the Magyar horsemen who settled here felt so at home. Endless grasslands perfect for galloping, though these days it's mostly used for growing crops and providing a really good excuse for why GPS sometimes gets confused. The western part of Hungary is dominated by a region called Transdanube, which sounds like it should be in Romania but isn't. Geography can be confusing like that. This area is hillier than the Great Plain, featuring gentle rolling countryside that looks like someone took the flat parts and gave them a few gentle nudges. Here you'll find Lake Balaton, Central Europe's largest lake, and Hungary's attempt at having a seaside resort without actually having a sea. Hungarians have embraced Lake Balaton with the enthusiasm of people who are determined to make the best of what they've got. And honestly, it's quite lovely, though you might want to manage your expectations if you're expecting Mediterranean vibes. Lake Balaton stretches for 77 kilometers and is shallow enough that you could probably walk across it in many places, though this isn't recommended unless you're particularly fond of explaining to confused lifeguards why you're suddenly in the middle of a lake. The lake has been a summer destination for centuries, and during the communist era, it was sometimes called the Hungarian Sea, with the kind of optimism that only comes from really wanting to believe you live near a beach. The water is warm and pleasant, the surrounding hills are dotted with vineyards, and if you squint just right and ignore the lack of tides, You can almost pretend you're at the Mediterranean. To the north of the Great Plain, Hungary rises into the northern Hungarian mountains, part of the Carpathian mountain system. These mountains reach their highest point at Kékes, which stands at 1,014 meters tall. Now, before you start planning your Everest-style expedition, remember that 1,014 meters is about as tall as 3 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Impressive for Hungary, but you probably won't need oxygen tanks or a team of Sherpas. The mountains are heavily forested and provide a nice change of scenery from the endless plains. Plus, they're home to some excellent hiking trails and the kind of views that make you understand why people write poetry about landscapes. The Danube River is Hungary's main waterway and one of Europe's most important rivers. It enters Hungary from Slovakia in the northwest and flows southeast through the country before continuing into Serbia. The Danube divides Hungary into 2 main regions. Everything west of the river is called Transdanubia, and everything east is called the Great Plain, which shows the kind of straightforward geographical naming that you have to appreciate. The river has been crucial to Hungarian history, serving as a highway for trade, invasion, and the occasional romantic boat ride, though the romantic boat rides were probably less frequent during the invasion periods. Budapest, the capital and largest city, straddles the Danube like a European version of a city that can't make up its mind which side of the river it wants to live on. The city is actually 2 cities that were merged, Buda on the west bank and Pest on the east bank, which were combined in 1873 along with a 3rd district called Óbuda, because apparently 2 cities weren't quite enough. Budapest is home to about 1.75 million people, which is nearly 20% of Hungary's entire population, making it the kind of capital city that contains a suspiciously large percentage of the country's people. It's as if everyone in Hungary looked around and decided that Budapest was definitely the place to be. The climate in Hungary is continental, which means hot summers, cold winters, and the kind of weather that keeps meteorologists employed year-round, trying to predict what's going to happen next. Summers can reach 35 degrees Celsius, which is perfect for enjoying those thermal baths, while winters can drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is perfect for appreciating indoor heating. The country receives moderate rainfall, though it's distributed unevenly throughout the year in the way that weather tends to be distributed. Never quite when you want it, always when you don't. Hungary's position in Central Europe has made it a crossroads for cultures, armies, and ideas for over 1,000 years. It sits at the intersection of major European trade routes and has been influenced by Germanic, Slavic, Turkish, and Byzantine cultures, creating a unique blend that is distinctly Hungarian. The Magyar language, unrelated to any of its neighbours' tongues, adds to Hungary's distinctive character. It's a Finno-Ugric language, more closely related to Finnish and Estonian than to German or Slavic languages, which must make for interesting conversations at European Union meetings. The country's natural resources include bauxite, coal, and natural gas, though not in quantities that would make other countries particularly envious. Hungary has made the most of what it has, developing industries around food processing, textiles, chemicals, and tourism. The thermal springs that dot the landscape have been used since Roman times and continue to attract visitors who come to soak in waters that have been heated by the Earth's core, nature's own spa treatment, though considerably older than most spa treatments, and probably with fewer cucumber slices. Hungarian agriculture benefits from the fertile soils of the Great Plain, where crops like wheat, corn, and sunflowers grow in fields that stretch to the horizon. The country is also famous for its wine production, particularly in regions like Tokaj, where sweet wines have been produced for centuries. Hungarian wine has a reputation that predates most countries' wine industries, and the volcanic soils in some regions produce wines that have been appreciated by everyone from kings to modern-day tourists who are just happy to find something that pairs well with goulash. The forests that cover about 22% of the country are home to deer, wild boar, and various bird species, creating ecosystems that have survived centuries of human habitation, with the persistence of nature adapting to whatever humans decide to do nearby. These forests provide timber, recreational opportunities, and the kind of peaceful woodland settings that make excellent backdrops for fairy tales, though Hungarian fairy tales tend to be a bit more complex than the standard, and they lived happily ever after variety. Hungary's geographic position has always been both a blessing and a challenge. Located at the crossroads between Western and Eastern Europe, the country has been enriched by cultural exchange, but has also found itself in the path of various armies, empires, and political movements throughout history. It's the kind of location that ensures you're never bored, but also means you should probably keep your passport updated and maybe learn a few phrases in several different languages, just in case. The Tisza River, Hungary's second major waterway, flows through the eastern part of the country and has played an equally important role in shaping the landscape and culture. The Tisza enters Hungary from Ukraine and meanders through the Great Plain in curves so elaborate that it looks like the river couldn't decide which direction it wanted to go and just decided to go in all of them. This meandering has created fertile floodplains that have been both a blessing and a source of considerable frustration over the centuries. Floods that bring rich soil are wonderful for farming, less wonderful for anyone who happens to live nearby during flood season. Hungary's border regions each have their own distinct character, shaped by centuries of interaction with neighbouring cultures. The western border with Austria represents the meeting point between Central and Western Europe, where Habsburg influence left its mark in architecture, cuisine, and administrative traditions. The northern border with Slovakia follows the natural boundaries created by the Carpathian foothills, creating a landscape of gentle hills and river valleys that have been home to both Hungarian and Slovak communities for centuries. It's the kind of border region where languages blend, recipes get shared across invisible lines, and people have learned that good neighbours make life considerably more pleasant than bad ones. The eastern border with Romania cuts across the Great Plain and includes parts of historical Transylvania, a region that has been home to Hungarian communities for over 1,000 years, but has been part of Romania since 1920. This creates the interesting situation where significant Hungarian populations live outside of Hungary proper, maintaining their language and culture while being citizens of another country entirely. Its geography complicated by history, politics complicated by ethnicity, and the kind of situation that keeps diplomatic services busy, but also demonstrates the resilience of cultural identity across political boundaries. The southern borders with Serbia and Croatia represent the frontier between Central Europe and the Balkans, a region where Hungarian influence historically extended much further south. These borderlands have seen armies, traders, refugees, and ideas flow back and forth for centuries, creating communities that blend Hungarian, Serbian, and Croatian influences in everything from architecture to music to local cuisine variations. Hungary's unique position in the Carpathian Basin has created a natural fortress, surrounded by mountains on most sides with river valleys, providing the main access routes. This geographic situation has influenced military strategy for centuries. The basin is relatively easy to defend once you control the mountain passes and river crossings, but also difficult to escape from if things go badly. The country's network of thermal springs is one of its most distinctive geographical features, with over 1,000 thermal springs scattered throughout the territory. These springs result from Hungary's position above significant geothermal activity, where underground water is heated by the Earth's core and emerges at temperatures ranging from warm to genuinely hot. The Romans recognized the value of these springs 2,000 years ago, and subsequent civilizations have continued to appreciate naturally heated pools. It's the kind of geological gift that makes winters more bearable and gives tourists an excellent reason to visit even when the weather isn't cooperating. The Great Hungarian Plain, or Puszta as it's known locally, represents one of Europe's last remaining steppe environments. This grassland ecosystem preserves a landscape that has remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years, home to traditional Hungarian grey cattle, Mangalitsa pigs with wool-like hair, and various bird species that depend on grassland habitats. It's a landscape that connects modern Hungary to its nomadic past, where herders and their animals moved across endless grasslands under vast skies. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine those endless Hungarian plains under starlit skies, where the wind moves through grass that has whispered the same songs for centuries. Picture the gentle lapping of Lake Balaton against its shores, and feel the warm waters of thermal springs that have been welcoming weary travellers for over 2,000 years. Sweet dreams, and welcome to Hungary, where geography and history have created a land that is uniquely, unmistakably itself. Chapter 2: Ancient Foundations. Long before the first Magyar horsemen ever set foot in the Carpathian Basin, this land was already writing history across its fertile soils and rolling hills. The story of Hungary begins not with the Hungarians themselves, but with a parade of peoples who looked at this strategic crossroads and thought, yes, this seems like a nice place to settle down, build some cities, and possibly get conquered by someone else in a few centuries. It's the kind of real estate that has always attracted attention, though not always the peaceful kind. The earliest inhabitants we know much about were the Pannonians, an Illyrian people who gave their name to what would become the Roman province of Pannonia. The Pannonians were a collection of tribes who had figured out that living in a basin surrounded by mountains was rather like having a natural fortress, assuming you could control who came through the mountain passes. They were reasonably successful at this for several centuries, which in ancient European terms is roughly equivalent to winning the lottery and then managing not to lose the ticket. Around the 4th century before Christ, the Celts decided that the Carpathian Basin looked rather appealing and began moving in from the west. These weren't your stereotypical Hollywood Celts with blue face paint. These were sophisticated people with advanced metalworking, agriculture, and the kind of organizational skills that let them spread across most of Europe without anyone thinking to ask for their travel documents. The Celtic settlement was extensive enough that many place names in the region still echo their language, which is impressive considering how many different groups have lived there since. The Celtic tribes who settled in the region included the Scordisci, the Boii, and the Toriski, names that sound like they should be characters in a fantasy novel but were actually quite real groups of people trying to make a living in an increasingly crowded part of Europe. The Scordisci controlled much of southern Transdanubia and were powerful enough to raid as far as Delphi, which takes considerable confidence when you consider that Delphi was where the Greeks went to ask the gods for advice. Apparently, the Scordisci decided they didn't need divine consultation for their expansion plans. The Boii were relative latecomers, arriving around 150 before Christ, and settling primarily in what is now Slovakia, though borders meant rather less in those days, and people tended to live where they could grow crops and avoid being attacked by their neighbours. The Taurici held the northern parts of Transdanubia, and managed to maintain generally friendly relations with Rome, which was the ancient equivalent of having excellent diplomatic insurance. Enter the Dacians, stage left, with their own ideas about who should control what. Around 50 before Christ, the Dacian king Burebista began expanding his territory from Transylvania and decided that the Celtic tribes in the Carpathian Basin would make excellent additions to his growing kingdom. Burebista was the kind of ruler who believed in the direct approach to diplomacy. If you wanted something, you conquered it. He defeated the Celtic tribal alliances and established Dacian settlements as far north as present-day Slovakia, proving that successful empire building often involves a lot of walking and very good logistics. However, Burebista's empire suffered from the same problem that plagued many ancient kingdoms. It was rather dependent on having Burebista around to run it. When he was assassinated by his political enemies, his domain was promptly divided into 4 parts, because apparently even his successors recognized that trying to manage such a large territory was more than any one person could reasonably handle. This division opened the door for the next major power to take an interest in the region: Rome. The Romans had been watching the goings-on in the Carpathian Basin with the kind of interest that usually meant someone was about to find themselves in need of better defences. Roman military expeditions into the region began as early as 156 before Christ, when they attacked the Scordisci. These early campaigns were more like aggressive reconnaissance missions. The Romans wanted to know what they were dealing with, who was dangerous, and what resources were available. Think of it as ancient strategic planning, but with considerably more armour involved. In 35 before Christ, the future Emperor Augustus led a significant campaign against the Pannonians and their allies. The Romans had a gift for methodical conquest. They would study their enemies, build their alliances, and then arrive with enough troops to make resistance seem like a poor life choice. Augustus captured the important fortress city of Siscia after a month-long siege, demonstrating both Roman military engineering and the kind of patience that comes from having a very well-organized supply chain. The Pannonians, being practical people, realized that being allied with the Dalmatians against Rome was perhaps not the wisest career move, but they gave it their best effort anyway. Between 15 before Christ and 9 after Christ, they engaged in almost continuous uprisings against Roman expansion. It's the kind of resistance that looks admirable in historical retrospect, but probably felt rather exhausting to the people who were actually living through it. Eventually, the Romans did what Romans did best. They brought in enough legions to make the outcome inevitable. The final subjugation came in 9 after Christ, when Pannonia was incorporated into the Roman province of Illyricum. This marked the beginning of what would be 4 centuries of Roman rule, though calling it rule might be slightly misleading. It was more like very organized administration backed by the implied threat of several legions. The Romans were excellent at this sort of thing, having had considerable practice throughout Europe, and they brought with them all the amenities of Roman civilization: roads, aqueducts, theatres, thermal baths, and tax collectors. In 7 after Christ, the Pannonians made one final attempt at independence, joining with the Dalmatians and other Illyrian tribes in what became known as the Great Illyrian Revolt. This was the kind of rebellion that made Rome take notice. It threatened Italy itself and was described by contemporary sources as the most dangerous crisis the empire had faced since Hannibal's invasion. The revolt lasted 3 years and required the personal attention of future Emperor Tiberius and his nephew Germanicus, along with several legions and considerable amounts of money that Rome would have preferred to spend on other things. After the revolt was finally crushed in 9 after Christ, Pannonia was organized as a separate province, because the Romans had learned that trying to govern rebellious territories from a distance was like trying to herd cats while wearing full armour. Technically possible, but unnecessarily complicated. The new province was garrisoned with 3 legions, which was Rome's way of saying we'd prefer not to have this conversation again. The province was later divided into Pannonia Superior in the west, with its capital at Carnuntum, and Pannonia Inferior in the east, with its capital at Aquincum, which would later become part of Budapest. Roman Pannonia became a prosperous frontier province, home to cities like Aquincum, which at its height had a population of around 40,000 people. larger than Budapest would be until the 19th century, which puts the Roman achievement in rather impressive perspective. The Romans established cities, built roads that are still used as foundations for modern highways, and created the kind of infrastructure that made trade, administration, and daily life considerably more convenient than it had been under previous arrangements. The thermal springs that had attracted previous inhabitants became the foundation for sophisticated Roman bath complexes, because if there's one thing Romans understood, it was the value of a good hot bath after a long day of conquering and administering provinces. They established vineyards, introduced new agricultural techniques, and created a monetary economy that connected the Carpathian Basin to trade networks stretching from Britain to Syria. It was the kind of comprehensive development that only comes from having both excellent engineering skills and virtually unlimited access to slave labour. Christianity arrived in Pannonia during the 4th century, around the time it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This represents one of those historical ironies that scholars love to point out. A religion that began with a carpenter in Palestine ended up being adopted by an empire that had crucified its founder and then spread to provinces that had spent considerable effort trying not to be part of that empire in the first place. The thermal springs that had been used for pagan rituals were converted for Christian baptisms, which was both practical and symbolically appropriate. However, by the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was beginning to experience the kind of problems that come from being very large, very wealthy, and surrounded by people who would like to be either or both of those things themselves. Various tribal groups began moving across the frontier, sometimes as invited settlers, sometimes as refugees, and sometimes as raiders who hadn't bothered to check whether their visits were welcome. The Western Roman Empire found itself spending more and more resources on defence and less on the kinds of public works that had made Roman civilization attractive in the first place. The end of Roman control came gradually and then suddenly, as these things often do. By 410 after Christ, Hunnic invasions had made Roman administration untenable, and by 433 the empire formally ceded Pannonia to the Huns. This was Rome's way of acknowledging that they had other priorities and that holding on to distant provinces was becoming prohibitively expensive, especially when those provinces required constant military intervention to remain Roman. The collapse of Roman authority opened the Carpathian Basin to a succession of peoples who would call it home for various lengths of time. The Huns under Attila created a significant empire based in the region, though it collapsed almost immediately after Attila's death in 453, proving that charismatic leadership and administrative continuity are not necessarily the same thing. The Ostrogoths took control briefly, followed by the Lombards and the Gepids, each group contributing to the complex cultural layering that would characterize the region for centuries to come. The Avars arrived in the region in the 560s and managed to establish a more durable presence, creating the Avar Khaganate that would control the Carpathian Basin for more than 2 centuries. The Avars were Turkic-speaking nomads who brought steppe traditions to the basin and who proved more successful than their predecessors at creating lasting institutions. They were eventually defeated by Charlemagne's Franks around 800, but their influence on the region's culture and settlement patterns would persist long after their political power had ended. Into this complex mix of peoples, languages, and traditions came various Slavic groups who had been settling in the region since the 6th century. By the 9th century, the Carpathian Basin was a patchwork of different communities, remnants of earlier peoples, Slavic settlers, Avar survivors, and Frankish administrative centres. It was the kind of multicultural environment that would have benefited from modern translation services, but which somehow managed to function through the universal languages of trade, intermarriage, and the occasional diplomatic feast. It was into this diverse and politically fragmented landscape that the Magyar tribes would arrive in 896, bringing with them their own traditions, their own language, and their own ideas about how the Carpathian Basin should be organized. They would find a land rich in resources, strategically positioned, and inhabited by people who had already proven that the basin could support sophisticated civilizations. The Magyars would build on these foundations, creating something new while incorporating elements from all the peoples who had come before them, because that's what successful societies do. They adapt, they learn, and they make themselves at home wherever they happen to settle down. Chapter 3: Medieval Kingdom and Golden Age. The transformation of Hungary from a collection of nomadic Magyar tribes to a medieval European powerhouse began with what might be the most consequential New Year's resolution in history. On either Christmas Day 1000 or January 1st, 1001, historians still debate which date has the honour. A Magyar prince named Varg, who had been baptized with a Christian named Stephen, received a crown from Pope Sylvester II and became the first king of Hungary. It was the kind of career change that doesn't happen very often, and it came with considerably more responsibility than most promotions. Stephen I, who would later become Saint Stephen, had inherited a complex political situation from his father Géza. The Magyar tribes had settled in the Carpathian Basin, but they were still organized along traditional tribal lines, with various chieftains holding considerable power and many people clinging to their ancestral pagan beliefs. Stephen looked at this situation and essentially decided that what Hungary needed was a complete organizational overhaul, the kind of comprehensive reform that would make modern management consultants very proud if they had existed in the 11th century. The first challenge Stephen faced was convincing his fellow Magyars that he should be their king rather than his cousin Kopani, who represented the traditional pagan faction and had the support of warriors who thought Christianity was just a passing fad. Stephen's approach to this disagreement was refreshingly direct. He defeated Kopani in battle with the help of foreign knights and native lords who had already embraced Christianity. Kopani was killed in the conflict, which settled the succession question definitively, though probably not in the way Kopani had hoped. Stephen's marriage to Gisela of Bavaria had been more than a romantic arrangement. It was a strategic alliance that connected Hungary to the Holy Roman Empire and provided Stephen with experienced military advisors who understood both warfare and the administrative complexities of running a Christian kingdom. It's the kind of political marriage that worked out well for everyone involved, assuming you don't count Kopani, who was rather beyond caring about political arrangements by that point. Once crowned, Stephen set about the enormous task of transforming Hungarian society. He established an ecclesiastical hierarchy by founding the Archbishopric of Esztergom, along with several bishoprics throughout the kingdom, effectively creating an independent Hungarian church that answered directly to Rome rather than to German archbishops. This was both religiously significant and politically clever, as it meant that Hungary's spiritual authority came from the Pope rather than from the Holy Roman Emperor, which helped maintain Hungarian independence while still being part of the Christian world. Stephen's laws regarding Christianity were comprehensive and forceful. He decreed that every 10 villages must build a church, which was the medieval equivalent of ensuring adequate religious infrastructure coverage. He invited foreign priests to Hungary to help with evangelization and issued strict punishments for anyone who persisted in pagan customs, which was his way of encouraging people to embrace the new religious direction with appropriate enthusiasm. The administrative reforms Stephen implemented were equally revolutionary. He organized the country into counties, each governed by royal officials called ispans, who were responsible for local administration, military organization, and ensuring that royal authority was respected throughout the kingdom. It was a system that created a more centralized state while allowing for regional administration, quite advanced for its time. Stephen's reign lasted until 1038, during which time he successfully defended Hungarian independence against various external threats while building the foundations of a European kingdom. When Emperor Conrad II attempted to invade Hungary in 1030, Stephen's forces compelled him to withdraw, proving that the new Christian kingdom was quite capable of defending itself. The personal tragedy of Stephen's reign was the death of his son and heir, Prince Emeric, in a hunting accident. Emeric had been groomed to continue his father's work and had shown promise as both a devout Christian and a capable leader. His death left Stephen without a direct heir and created a succession crisis that would trouble the kingdom after Stephen's own death. It's the kind of family tragedy that affects not just individuals but entire nations, especially when those individuals happen to be kings. Stephen died on August 15th, 1038, and was buried in the basilica he had built at Székesfehérvár, which would become the traditional coronation and burial place for Hungarian kings. He was canonized in 1083, along with his son Emeric, and became the patron saint of Hungary. The timing of his canonization suggests that by the late 11th century, people had concluded that Stephen's reign had been divinely inspired, which is the kind of posthumous recognition that most rulers can only dream of achieving. The Arpad dynasty that Stephen founded would rule Hungary for 3 centuries, making it one of the longest-lasting royal dynasties in European history. During these 300 years, Hungary evolved from Stephen's carefully organized kingdom into a major European power, with periods of expansion, prosperity, and cultural flowering that would establish Hungary as one of the significant medieval kingdoms. The period from the late 13th to late 14th century marked what historians consider Hungary's medieval golden age, beginning with the Angevin kings. Charles I, known as Charles Robert, became king in 1308 after a lengthy struggle against the oligarchs who had divided the country among themselves following the end of the Arpad line. Charles was related to the Arpads through his mother, which gave him a legitimate claim to the throne, though convincing everyone of this required about 20 years of persistent effort and occasional military action. Charles I's greatest achievement was establishing a monetary system based on gold, which immediately elevated Hungary's status in European commerce. Hungary's gold mines, particularly those in Transylvania, produced wealth that made the kingdom one of the richest in Europe, and Charles had the good sense to mint coins that met international standards of weight and purity. The Hungarian gold florin became as trusted as its Florentine counterpart, which meant that Hungarian money was welcome anywhere. European merchants gathered, a development that did wonders for the kingdom's international reputation. The reign of Charles's son, Louis the Great, from 1342 to 1382, represented the pinnacle of Angevin Hungary. Louis was the kind of king who believed that if you had a strong army and considerable wealth, you should probably use both to expand your influence, which he did with remarkable success. He conducted military campaigns in Naples, conquered Dalmatian cities from Venice, and extended Hungarian influence into the Balkans and beyond. Louis's military activities were extensive enough to keep chroniclers busy for decades. He fought against the Bulgarians, the Lithuanians, and various other groups who found themselves in disagreement with Hungarian policy. He even organized expeditions against the Golden Horde, which takes considerable confidence when you consider that the Golden Horde had been terrorizing Eastern Europe for over a century. Louis was also crowned King of Poland in 1370, making him one of the few rulers to hold both Hungarian and Polish crowns simultaneously. The prosperity of Louis's reign was reflected in the kingdom's population growth and urban development. By the end of his reign, Hungary had a population of about 3 million people and contained 49 royal boroughs, over 500 market towns, and more than 26,000 villages. This demographic and economic expansion indicated a kingdom where people felt secure enough to build families and businesses. The cultural achievements of the Angevin period were as remarkable as the military and economic ones. The royal court became a centre of Gothic architecture and art, with new castles built at Visegrad, Diosgyőr, and other locations. The illuminated chronicle, created during this period, represents one of the finest examples of medieval book illumination and demonstrates that Hungarian scribes and artists were working at the highest European standards. Following the Angevin period, Hungary experienced the kind of political instability that tends to happen when strong dynasties end and various factions begin competing for power. However, this instability led to one of the most remarkable figures in Hungarian history, John Hunyadi, whose military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire would earn him a place among the great medieval commanders, and whose son would become perhaps Hungary's most famous king. John Hunyadi emerged during the reign of Sigismund of Luxembourg and quickly established himself as the kingdom's premier military commander. His victory at the Siege of Belgrade in 1456 was one of the most significant defeats inflicted on the Ottoman Empire during its expansion into Europe, and it stabilized Hungary's southern frontier for more than half a century. Hunyadi's success came from his understanding of both traditional European military tactics and the innovative methods used by the Ottomans, allowing him to develop strategies that could counter Ottoman advantages in mobility and archery. The death of John Hunyadi in 1456, shortly after his triumph at Belgrade, set in motion a series of events that would bring his younger son Matthias to the Hungarian throne. Matthias was only 15 when his father died, and he spent time imprisoned in Prague due to political machinations surrounding the succession. However, in 1458, the Hungarian nobility elected Matthias as their king, making him the first ruler without dynastic ancestry to hold the Hungarian crown since Stephen I. The reign of Matthias Corvinus from 1458 to 1490 represents what many historians consider the absolute zenith of medieval Hungarian power and culture. Matthias was a Renaissance king in every sense, a military commander, a patron of arts and learning, a legal reformer, and a political strategist who understood both the opportunities and dangers facing Hungary in the late 15th century. Matthias's military innovations included the creation of the Black Army, one of Europe's first professional standing armies. This force consisted of about 20,000 troops, including cavalry and infantry, recruited from various parts of the Hungarian domains and paid directly by the royal treasury. The Black Army was disciplined, well-equipped, and loyal to the king rather than to local magnates, giving Matthias a military instrument that could be deployed quickly and effectively wherever it was needed. The financial reforms that supported the Black Army were as revolutionary as the military organization itself. Matthias introduced new forms of taxation that generated enormous revenues. Estimates suggest his annual income reached 650,000 golden florins, with more than 60% coming from extraordinary taxes levied directly on the peasantry. This was controversial but effective, providing the king with the resources needed to maintain his professional army and conduct extensive military campaigns. Matthias's conquests were remarkable even by medieval standards. He became king of Bohemia in 1468, taking control of Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia. His campaigns against the Holy Roman Empire resulted in the capture of Vienna in 1485, making him the only Hungarian king to hold the Austrian capital. At the time of his death, Matthias ruled an empire that stretched from Brandenburg to Serbia. The cultural achievements of Matthias's reign were equally impressive. His library, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, was one of the largest in Europe, containing thousands of manuscripts. Matthias attracted scholars, artists, and writers from throughout Europe to his court, creating a cultural centre that rivaled Florence or Paris. The The first printing press in Hungary was established during his reign, and universities were founded at Poznań and Buda. Matthias was known throughout Europe as Matthias the Just for his legal reforms and concern for common people. Hungarian folklore is filled with stories of the king travelling in disguise among his subjects to learn about their lives and ensure that justice was being administered fairly. While these stories may be legendary, they reflect the genuine respect that Matthias earned through his efforts to create a more equitable legal system. The death of Matthias in 1490 marked the end of Hungary's golden age. Within months of his death, the conquests that had taken decades to achieve were lost, the Black Army was disbanded, and Hungary returned to the decentralized feudal structure that Matthias had worked to overcome. The Hungarian nobility quickly moved to restore their traditional privileges and reduce royal power. The saying that arose after Matthias's death, "King Matthias has died, and justice with him," captures both the affection that Hungarians felt for their Renaissance king and the recognition that his death marked the end of an era. The kingdom that had stood as one of Europe's great powers found itself weakened just as new threats were emerging on its southern borders. Chapter 4: Ottoman period and Habsburg rule. The dawn of August 29th, 1526, brought with it one of those days that changed the course of history, though nobody involved probably had reshaped Central Europe on their morning agenda. Near the town of Mohacs, on a marshy plain beside the Danube, two armies faced each other in what would become the most consequential battle in Hungarian history. On one side stood 20-year-old King Louis II with about 25,000 Hungarian troops, feeling confident about their chances. On the other side, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had brought roughly 50,000 Ottoman soldiers, along with 300 cannons to Hungary's 85. It was the kind of mathematical disadvantage that should have suggested a different strategic approach. The Battle of Mohacs lasted about 3 hours, which in historical terms is remarkably brief for an event that would determine the fate of a kingdom. Louis II had been advised by his experienced commanders to wait for reinforcements from Transylvania and Croatia, but the young king was eager to prove himself and decided that immediate action was preferable to patient strategy. It was the sort of decision that looks very different in hindsight than it did at the time, especially when you consider that the reinforcements were only a few days' march away. The Hungarian army was arranged in the traditional European style, with heavily armoured knights expecting to charge through enemy lines in the way that had worked for centuries. Unfortunately for the Hungarians, the Ottomans had developed military tactics that were specifically designed to counter exactly this approach. The Ottoman forces included janissaries armed with firearms, Sipahi cavalry, and massive artillery support, creating a combined arms approach that represented some of the most advanced military thinking of the 16th century. When the Hungarian cavalry charged, they initially caused considerable damage to the Ottoman vanguard, which must have been encouraging for about 15 minutes. However, the Ottoman response was swift and devastating. The janissaries, who were professional soldiers rather than feudal levies, formed disciplined ranks and poured musket fire into the Hungarian knights. Meanwhile, Ottoman artillery tore gaps in the Hungarian lines, and the Sipahi light cavalry began outflanking the Hungarian forces with the kind of mobility that heavy armour makes difficult to counter. King Louis II died during the retreat, though the exact circumstances remain a matter of historical debate. The most commonly accepted account is that he fell from his horse while trying to cross the swollen Shele stream and drowned under the weight of his armour, which was probably not how he had envisioned his reign ending when he woke up that morning. Along with the king died much of the Hungarian nobility, including Archbishop Paltamori and many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders. It was the kind of leadership vacuum that makes recovery from military defeat nearly impossible. The Ottoman victory at Mohacs was so complete that Suleiman was reportedly surprised by how easily the Hungarian forces had been defeated. The Sultan proceeded to Buda, the Hungarian capital, which he occupied without resistance in September. However, rather than establishing a permanent garrison, the Ottomans withdrew after plundering the city, taking with them over 100,000 captives. This decision would have significant consequences, as it left Hungary in a state of political chaos without clearly establishing Ottoman authority. The death of Louis II created a succession crisis that perfectly illustrates why having a clear line of royal succession is generally considered important. Two claimants emerged for the Hungarian throne: John Zápolya, who had been the voivode of Transylvania and had, fortunately for him, missed the Battle of Mohacs entirely, and Ferdinand of Habsburg, who was Louis's brother-in-law and had the backing of the Holy Roman Empire. Both men were elected king by rival factions of the Hungarian nobility, which was the medieval equivalent of having two different groups declare themselves the legitimate government. This dual kingship situation led to a civil war that lasted for over a decade and effectively prevented any organized resistance to further Ottoman expansion. Ferdinand controlled the western parts of Hungary with Habsburg support, while John Zápolya held the eastern regions and, crucially, had the backing of Sultan Suleiman. It was an arrangement that worked well for the Ottomans, who could support whichever Hungarian claimant was most useful, while gradually extending their own control over Hungarian territory. In 1541, the Ottomans decided to end the pretense of supporting Hungarian independence and occupied Buda permanently, incorporating central Hungary into the Ottoman administrative system. This marked the beginning of what historians call the trisection of Hungary, a division that would last for over 150 years and fundamentally alter the character of the Hungarian lands. Royal Hungary, controlled by the Habsburg dynasty, consisted of the western and northern parts of the original kingdom, including most of present-day Slovakia and the western regions of Transdanubia. This territory was ruled from Pressburg, which became the new Hungarian capital since Buda was no longer available. Royal Hungary maintained Hungarian laws and institutions, at least in theory, though in practice it became increasingly integrated into the Habsburg Empire and subject to Austrian administrative control. The central and southern regions of Hungary became Ottoman Hungary, directly administered by the Ottoman Empire as a province ruled by pashas based in Buda. The Ottomans implemented their standard administrative system, dividing the territory into sanjaks and establishing the Timar system of land grants to support their military forces. For the Hungarian population, this meant replacing Hungarian nobles with Ottoman officials and converting much of the land into military fiefs that could be reassigned according to Ottoman needs rather than Hungarian traditions. The eastern part of the former kingdom evolved into the Principality of Transylvania, which maintained a complex relationship with both the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy. Transylvania was technically an Ottoman vassal state, with its princes paying tribute to the Sultan, but it also retained considerable autonomy and often played the Ottomans and Habsburgs against each other to maximize its independence. It was the kind of diplomatic balancing act that required considerable skill and occasional luck. The Principality of Transylvania became a haven for Hungarian culture and Protestant Christianity during this period. While Royal Hungary was subject to Habsburg counter-Reformation efforts that suppressed Protestant worship, and Ottoman Hungary experienced pressure to convert to Islam, Transylvania maintained religious tolerance that allowed various Christian denominations to coexist. The Edict of Torda in 1568 established religious freedom for Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed Christians, and Unitarians, making Transylvania one of the most religiously tolerant states in 16th century Europe. The most successful princes of Transylvania learned to navigate the complex political situation by maintaining good relations with both major powers while pursuing policies that benefited their principality. Istvan Báthory, who later became King of Poland, and Gábor Bethlen were particularly adept at this diplomatic juggling act. Bethlen, in particular, used his position to develop Transylvania's economy through mercantilist policies, establishing a monopoly on foreign trade that generated considerable wealth for the principality. Life in the three parts of divided Hungary varied considerably depending on which power controlled the territory. In Royal Hungary, the population faced the challenges of living in a frontier province of the Habsburg Empire, with constant military campaigns and the economic burden of supporting border fortifications. The Habsburgs established a military frontier along the Ottoman border, staffed largely by Serb and Vlach refugees who received land grants in exchange for military service. Ottoman Hungary experienced the most dramatic changes, as the Ottoman system of administration replaced Hungarian feudal structures entirely. The Ottomans became the sole landowners in their territory, managing about 20% of the land directly for government benefit and distributing the rest as timars to support soldiers and administrators. Hungarian nobles either fled to Royal Hungary or Transylvania, converted to Islam to maintain their positions, or found themselves reduced to the status of common taxpayers. The Ottoman period saw significant demographic changes in central and southern Hungary. Many Hungarian settlements were abandoned or destroyed during the constant warfare, and the Ottomans encouraged settlement by various groups including Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Orthodox Christians who were considered more reliable than the Catholic Hungarian population. By the end of the Ottoman period, the ethnic composition of these regions had changed dramatically, with Hungarians becoming a minority in many areas where they had previously been the dominant population. Despite the destruction caused by warfare, the Ottoman period also brought certain benefits to the territories under their control. The Ottomans were generally tolerant of religious diversity, allowing various Christian denominations to practice their faith as long as they paid appropriate taxes. They also introduced new crops and agricultural techniques, built thermal baths and other infrastructure, and established schools and libraries in the major cities. The famous thermal baths of Budapest, which remain popular today, were largely developed during the Ottoman period. The balance of power between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires began shifting in the late 17th century, partly due to Ottoman military failures in other theatres, and partly due to the increasing military effectiveness of Habsburg forces. The failed Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683 marked a turning point, as the Holy League, formed by various European powers, began a systematic campaign to drive the Ottomans out of Europe. Prince Eugene of Savoy, one of the greatest military commanders of the period, led a series of campaigns that gradually liberated Hungarian territory from Ottoman control. The recapture of Buda in 1686 was particularly significant, both militarily and symbolically, as it restored the ancient Hungarian capital to Christian rule after 145 years of Ottoman occupation. The Great Turkish War ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which formalized Ottoman recognition of Habsburg control over most of the former Kingdom of Hungary. The Ottomans retained only a small area in the south, including Belgrade, but for practical purposes the age of Ottoman rule in Hungary was over. The treaty marked the beginning of a new chapter in Hungarian history, though it would take time to determine whether Habsburg rule would prove more beneficial than Ottoman administration had been. The reunification of Hungary under Habsburg rule brought new challenges and opportunities. The territories that had been under Ottoman control for over a century required extensive reconstruction, as many areas had been depopulated and much infrastructure had been destroyed or neglected. The Habsburgs faced the enormous task of integrating three very different regions: Royal Hungary with its Austrian influences, the former Ottoman territories with their mixed populations, and Transylvania with its tradition of autonomy, into a single administrative system. The religious situation was particularly complex, as the counter-reformation that had been imposed on Royal Hungary conflicted with the religious tolerance that had characterized both Ottoman Hungary and Transylvania. The Habsburg approach of promoting Catholicism while suppressing Protestantism created tension in regions where various denominations had coexisted peacefully for generations, adding another layer of difficulty to the already challenging process of reunification. Despite these challenges, the end of the Ottoman period and the beginning of comprehensive Habsburg rule represented a new phase in Hungarian development. The constant warfare that had devastated the country for over a century and a half was finally ending, allowing for reconstruction and economic recovery. However, the price of this stability was the loss of Hungarian independence, as the country became increasingly integrated into the Habsburg Empire. Rather than maintaining its traditional status as a separate kingdom, it was a trade-off that would define Hungarian politics for centuries to come, as Hungarians struggled to balance the benefits of Habsburg protection and economic development against their desire for national autonomy and self-go. Chapter 5. Modern Struggles and Revolution. The 19th century dawned on Hungary with the kind of gradual awakening that historians later describe as the slow emergence of national consciousness, though at the time it probably felt more like a persistent headache that wouldn't go away despite various political remedies. The Habsburg Empire's approach to governing Hungary had been thorough, but not particularly inspiring. Efficient administration, Catholic counter-reformation, and the steady replacement of Hungarian institutions with Austrian ones. By 1800, many Hungarians were beginning to wonder whether being part of a great empire was worth feeling like foreigners in their own homeland. The first stirrings of the Hungarian reform movement emerged from the Hungarian Diet, reconvened in 1825 to deal with financial issues. The Habsburg monarchy needed more money than it had, requiring consultation with the Hungarian nobility about possible tax increases. What the Austrians didn't anticipate was that once you give politicians a forum to discuss money, they tend to expand the conversation to include everything else they think is wrong. The leading figure to emerge was Count István Széchenyi, who believed Hungary could modernize while maintaining its connection to the Habsburg Empire. He advocated for economic development, infrastructure improvements, and gradual social reform, essentially believing that everyone could get along if they just tried harder. His most visible achievement was championing the chain bridge connecting Buda and Pest, completed in 1849, representing both practical progress and symbolic unity. The more radical voice belonged to Lajos Kossuth, a lawyer and journalist who published Pesti Hírlap, which became the primary outlet for Hungarian nationalist sentiment and was banned by Vienna in 1844. Being banned by the government is often excellent publicity for political publications, and Kossuth's reputation as a champion of Hungarian independence was considerably enhanced by Austrian censorship efforts. In 1847, Kossuth was elected to the Hungarian Diet, where his oratorical skills quickly made him leader of the radical faction. The spark that ignited revolution came from events in France. In February 1848, revolution broke out in Paris, and within weeks the spirit of rebellion was spreading across Europe. On March 3, 1848, Kossuth delivered what would become one of the most influential speeches in Hungarian history. Kossuth's speech on March 3, 1848, was the kind of rhetorical performance that people quote for generations afterward. He demanded parliamentary government for Hungary and constitutional government for the rest of Austria, appealing to Franz Joseph as our beloved Archduke, while simultaneously making it clear that beloved or not, significant changes were expected. The speech was powerful enough to convince the Diet to approve his motion for an independent Hungarian ministry, which was the parliamentary equivalent of announcing that Hungary intended to manage its own affairs. Thank you very much. Events moved rapidly after Kossuth's speech, accelerated by revolution in Vienna on March 13th. which made the Habsburg government suddenly more accommodating. Emperor Ferdinand appointed Count Louis Batthyány as Hungary's first responsible prime minister, leading a ministry that included both Kossuth and Széchenyi. The Hungarian parliament quickly passed the April laws, establishing Hungary as a constitutional monarchy with its own parliament, responsible government, and civil liberties including freedom of the press and religious equality. The laws also abolished serfdom, enormously popular with the peasantry. Hungary became the third country in continental Europe to implement democratic parliamentary elections. However, the Hungarian Revolution's emphasis on Magyar national identity made non-Magyar populations nervous about their futures. Croatia, under Ban Josip Jelačić, concluded that Croatian interests might be better served by supporting Vienna against Hungarian independence. The nationality problem illustrates one of the persistent challenges of nationalism in multi-ethnic regions. Different groups often have conflicting ideas about who should determine what for whom. In September 1848, Croatian forces crossed into Hungary, transforming constitutional crisis into actual war. The Hungarian Diet created a Committee of National Defense with Kossuth as president, making him military dictator of revolutionary Hungary. The Hungarian army, the Honved, grew to about 170,000 troops and proved surprisingly effective. Many experienced officers from the Imperial Army joined the revolution, bringing professional military knowledge. In April 1849, buoyed by military successes, the Hungarian parliament issued a declaration of independence that dethroned the Habsburg dynasty and declared Hungary a republic with Kossuth as governor-president. This made compromise essentially impossible, since it's difficult to negotiate with people you've just fired from being your emperors. The Hungarian declaration alarmed European powers worried about revolutionary republicanism. Young Emperor Franz Joseph appealed to Tsar Nicholas for Russian military assistance. Nicholas obliged, both because he opposed revolutionary movements and because he worried about the example Hungarian independence might set for Polish nationalists within the Russian Empire. Russian intervention changed the military balance against Hungary. While the Hungarian army had fought Austrian troops effectively, taking on two major empires was considerably more challenging. By August 1849, the situation was hopeless, and Kossuth abdicated in favour of General Artur Gergely. Gergely surrendered to the Russians at Vilagos on August 13, 1849. The aftermath was harsh. 13 Hungarian generals were executed at Arad, an event central to Hungarian national martyrology, while revolutionary leaders were imprisoned or fled into exile. The April laws were revoked, the constitution suspended, and Hungary placed under direct military administration. The revolution's failure might have permanently ended Hungarian autonomy aspirations, except that the Habsburg Empire continued facing external challenges. The 7 Weeks' War of 1866, in which Austria was defeated by Prussia, convinced Emperor Franz Joseph that he needed Hungarian support to maintain the empire's great power status. The result was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich. This created the dual monarchy, in which Franz Joseph ruled as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, with both halves maintaining separate parliaments and governments while sharing foreign policy and defence. The compromise represented partial victory for Hungarian nationalism, restoring many 1848 reforms while avoiding republican radicalism. Under the dual monarchy, Hungary experienced significant development. The country industrialized rapidly, Budapest grew into a major European city, and Hungarian culture flourished. However, the government pursued Magyarization policies, requiring Hungarian language use in schools and government, creating problems with non-Magyar nationalities. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the 20th century as one of Europe's great powers, but the empire's multinational character made it increasingly difficult to govern as nationalist movements gained strength. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, provided the spark that ignited World War I. Hungary's role in the events leading to World War I was complex, as Hungarian political leaders were generally less enthusiastic about Balkan adventures than their Austrian counterparts. Prime Minister István Tisza initially opposed war with Serbia, warning it might lead to general European conflict, but eventually supported the decision after receiving assurances about German support. His use of the term Weltkrieg in a memorandum to Franz Joseph proved remarkably prescient about the coming conflict's scope. The Hungarian Diet created a Committee of National Defence with Kossuth as president, making him military dictator of revolutionary Hungary. The Hungarian army, the Honved, grew to about 170,000 troops and proved surprisingly effective. Many experienced officers joined the revolution. In April 1849, buoyed by military successes during what became known as the Spring Campaign, the Hungarian Parliament issued a declaration of independence that formally dethroned the Habsburg dynasty and declared Hungary a republic, with Kossuth as governor-president. This was the point at which compromise with Austria became essentially impossible, since it's difficult to negotiate with people whom you've just officially fired from being your emperors. The Hungarian Declaration of Independence alarmed not only the Austrian government, but also other European powers who worried about the spread of revolutionary republicanism. The young emperor, Franz Joseph, who had come to the throne in December 1848 after his uncle Ferdinand abdicated, appealed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia for military assistance. Nicholas was happy to oblige, both because he opposed revolutionary movements in general and because he was concerned about the example Hungarian independence might set for Polish nationalists within the Russian Empire. The intervention of Russian forces fundamentally changed the military balance against Hungary. While the Hungarian army had proven capable of fighting Austrian troops, taking on the combined forces of two major empires was a considerably more challenging proposition. Russian intervention also meant that the Hungarian cause lost any possibility of support from Western European powers who were not eager to antagonize the Tsar over a revolutionary republic that most of them viewed with suspicion anyway. By August 1849, the military situation had become hopeless, and Kossuth abdicated in favour of General Artur Görgy, hoping that a military commander might be able to negotiate better surrender terms than a political revolutionary. Görgy surrendered to the Russians at Vilagos on August 13, 1849, ending the Hungarian War of Independence after approximately 18 months of constitutional crisis, revolution and warfare. The aftermath of the revolution was harsh, as Habsburg retribution tends to be when empires are seriously challenged. 13 Hungarian generals were executed at Arad, an event that became central to Hungarian national martyrology, while many other revolutionary leaders were imprisoned or, like Kossuth himself, fled into exile. The April laws were revoked, the Hungarian constitution was suspended, and the country was placed under direct military administration from Vienna, which was the Habsburg way of ensuring that constitutional experiments would not be repeated in the immediate future. The failure of the 1848 revolution might have permanently ended Hungarian aspirations for autonomy, except that the Habsburg Empire continued to face external challenges that required internal compromises. The 7 Weeks' War of 1866, in which Austria was defeated by Prussia, fundamentally altered the balance of power in Central Europe and convinced Emperor Franz Joseph that he needed Hungarian support to maintain the empire's position as a great power. The result of these changed circumstances was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, known in German as the Ausgleich and in Hungarian as the Kiegyezés. This agreement created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, in which Franz Joseph ruled as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, with both halves of the empire maintaining separate parliaments governments, and considerable domestic autonomy, while sharing foreign policy, defence, and certain financial arrangements. The compromise represented a partial victory for Hungarian nationalism, restoring many of the reforms that had been demanded in 1848, while avoiding the republican radicalism that had made compromise impossible during the revolution. Under the dual monarchy, Hungary experienced significant economic and social development. The country industrialized rapidly, Budapest grew into a major European city, and Hungarian culture flourished in ways that had been impossible under direct Austrian rule. The compromise also allowed Hungary to maintain its historical connection to Transylvania, which was incorporated back into the Hungarian kingdom, reuniting territories that had been separated since the Ottoman period. However, the government pursued policies of Magyarization that required the use of Hungarian language in schools and government, which created resentment among Slovak, Romanian, Croatian, and other ethnic groups. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the 20th century as one of Europe's great powers, but the empire's multinational character made it increasingly difficult to govern as nationalist movements gained strength. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, provided the spark that ignited World War I. Hungary's role in the events leading to World War I was complex, as Hungarian leaders were generally less enthusiastic about Balkan adventures. Prime Minister István Tisza initially opposed war with Serbia, but eventually supported the decision. The war that began in August 1914 would ultimately destroy the Austro-Hungarian Empire and end over 4 centuries of Habsburg rule, representing both the culmination of the struggle between Hungarian nationalism and Habsburg imperialism and the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Chapter 6: Communist Era to Present. The devastating conclusion of World War II left Hungary facing the kind of reckoning that follows defeat in a global catastrophe. The war had cost Hungary over 400,000 lives, destroyed much of its infrastructure, and thoroughly discredited the political system that had led the country into alliance with Nazi Germany. As Soviet troops established control over Hungarian territory in early 1945, it became clear that Hungary's future would be determined not by Hungarians themselves, but by the victorious powers who viewed the country as part of the spoils of war. The initial post-war period began with what appeared to be a promising democratic experiment. The Allied Control Commission, dominated by the Soviet Union under Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, established a provisional government that included representatives from multiple political parties. Stalin, perhaps surprisingly, initially instructed Hungarian communist leaders to pursue a gradual approach rather than immediate seizure of power, calculating that a slow takeover would draw less Western attention and criticism than the rapid communist consolidations occurring in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Hungarian Communist Party, led by Matthias Rákosi, who had spent the war years in the Soviet Union, suffered a crushing defeat in Hungary's first free post-war elections in November 1945. The Agrarian Independent Smallholders Party won an absolute majority with 57% of the vote, while the Communists managed only 17%, actually receiving fewer votes than the Social Democrats. This electoral result demonstrated that Hungarians, given a genuine choice, decisively rejected communist rule. However, democracy was not to be Hungary's fate. Despite their electoral failure, the Communists received key government positions, most importantly, the Ministry of Interior with control over the police, due to Soviet pressure to maintain a coalition government. From this strategic position, Rákosi implemented what he later termed salami tactics, the systematic weakening, splitting, and elimination of independent political forces piece by piece. The method was devastatingly effective. by threatening arrest, forcing resignations, and gradually purging non-communist politicians as fascists or reactionaries. The communists steadily consolidated power despite lacking popular support. By June 1948, the Communist Party had forced the Social Democrats to merge with them, creating the Hungarian Working People's Party under Rákosi's leadership. The following year, elections were held with a single list of candidates, and a new Soviet-style constitution was proclaimed on August 20th. Deliberately chosen to transform Hungary's traditional street, Stephen's Day, into the politically inspired Constitution Day. Hungary had officially become a People's Republic, though the people had little say in the matter. Rákosi, who described himself as Stalin's best Hungarian disciple and Stalin's best pupil, imposed a totalitarian system that was among the harshest in Eastern Europe. The regime collectivized agriculture, nationalized industry, and launched ambitious but economically disastrous 5-year plans focused on heavy industry rather than consumer goods. The human cost was enormous. Approximately 350,000 officials and intellectuals were purged, thousands were executed or died in prison, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens lived in fear of the AVH secret police. The RVH, established by Interior Minister László Rajk, employed over 300,000 informers who maintained files on more than 10% of the population. The secret police used intimidation, false accusations, imprisonment, and torture to suppress any form of political opposition. Show trials modelled on Stalin's purges eliminated perceived enemies, including Rajk himself, who was executed in 1949 in a grotesque display of revolutionary cannibalism that demonstrated no one was safe from the regime's paranoia. Stalin's death in March 1953 created an opportunity for change, as the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev began questioning the excesses of Stalinist rule. In July 1953, Moscow forced Rákosi to give up the prime ministership to Imre Nagy, a reformist communist who promised a new course featuring an end to forced industrialization, more consumer goods, no more agricultural collectivization, release of political prisoners, and closing of internment camps. Nagy's reform program provided genuine relief for ordinary Hungarians, but it also created tensions within the communist system. Rákosi, who remained party leader, worked systematically to undermine Nagy's reforms and ultimately succeeded in having him dismissed from office in April 1955. The restoration of hardline policies created growing resentment among Hungarians who had tasted the possibility of a more humane system, setting the stage for more dramatic confrontation. The catalyst for revolution came from an unexpected source: Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, which denounced Stalin's crimes and cult of personality. The speech, which was not particularly secret for long, emboldened reform movements throughout Eastern Europe and fatally undermined the legitimacy of Stalin's disciples like Rákosi. In July 1956, Moscow forced Rákosi to resign, though his replacement, Ernő Zseru, was almost equally detested by the Hungarian people. The Hungarian Revolution began on October 23, 1956, when university students organized a demonstration of solidarity with Polish reforms that quickly transformed into a massive anti-communist uprising. The revolution started with the symbolic destruction of Stalin's statue in Budapest and the reading of student demands for political reform, free elections, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. When students attempted to broadcast their demands on Hungarian radio, RVH guards opened fire, killing several demonstrators and sparking a nationwide revolt. Within days, the revolution had spread throughout Hungary as local councils assumed control, political prisoners were released, and Hungarian military units joined the uprising. The The Soviet Union initially appeared willing to negotiate, and Imre Nagy was restored as prime minister with a mandate to implement democratic reforms. Nagy announced the end of one-party rule, the withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, and Hungary's neutrality in the Cold War, decisions that went far beyond what Moscow was prepared to accept. On November 4th, 1956, massive Soviet forces launched Operation Whirlwind, crushing the Hungarian Revolution with overwhelming military force. The fighting lasted several days and cost approximately 3,000 Hungarian lives, with hundreds of thousands more fleeing the country as refugees. Nagy was arrested during the Soviet assault, later executed, and his body dumped in an unmarked grave, while János Kádár, who had defected from Nagy's government, was installed as the new Soviet-backed leader. Kádár's rule, which lasted from 1956 to 1988, represented a more pragmatic form of communist authoritarianism. After the initial period of severe repression following the revolution, Kádár introduced what became known as goulash communism, a system that traded political freedom for modest economic improvements and relative social stability. The regime's unofficial motto became, "Those who are not against us are with us," a significant relaxation from Rákosi's "Those who are not with us are against us." Under Kádár, Hungary became the most liberal country in the Eastern Bloc, with limited market mechanisms, easier travel to Western countries, and a generally less repressive atmosphere than other Soviet satellites. The new economic mechanism, introduced in 1968, allowed some private enterprise and market pricing, making Hungary's economy more flexible than the rigid central planning systems elsewhere in Eastern Europe. This Hungarian model provided a better standard of living than most communist countries, which helped maintain social peace for several decades. However, even goulash communism could not solve the fundamental contradictions of the communist system. By the 1980s, Hungary faced mounting economic problems, including inflation, debt, and declining living standards. A 1986 survey found that 61% of Hungarians described their situation as hopeless or continually worsening, while 80% believed Austrians enjoyed a higher standard of living. The economic crisis was accompanied by growing political pressure for change, particularly from intellectuals and students who had never accepted communist rule as legitimate. The decisive break came in 1988 when Kádár was forced to resign as party leader, replaced by reformers who acknowledged that fundamental change was necessary. The following year brought rapid political transformation as the Communist Party abandoned its monopoly on power and entered into roundtable negotiations with emerging opposition groups including Fidesz, a student organization led by a young Viktor Orbán, and the Hungarian Democratic Forum. The symbolic moment that marked the end of communist rule came in June 1989, with the reinterment of Imre Nagy and his fellow martyrs from the 1956 revolution. Over 200,000 people attended the ceremony, where 26-year-old Viktor Orbán delivered a speech calling for free elections and the withdrawal of all Soviet troops from Hungary. The willingness of the authorities to allow this massive demonstration of anti-communist sentiment made clear that the old system was finished. Hungary played a crucial role in the broader collapse of communist Eastern Europe through its decision to open the Iron Curtain with Austria in May 1989. Hungarian border guards began dismantling the 240-kilometre electrified fence that had separated East from West, and in August, the pan-European picnic near Sopron allowed hundreds of East Germans to cross into Austria unimpeded. This breach in the Iron Curtain triggered a chain reaction that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the peaceful collapse of communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. The transition to democracy was remarkably peaceful, accomplished through negotiations rather than violence. Free elections in March 1990 resulted in victory for the Hungarian Democratic Forum under Joseph Antal, who became Hungary's first democratically elected prime minister since the 1940s. the new government faced enormous challenges, transforming a centrally planned economy into a market system, rebuilding democratic institutions, and addressing the social costs of economic transition. The 1990s were a difficult period for most Hungarians, as the transition to capitalism brought unemployment, inflation, and the collapse of many state enterprises. Living standards declined significantly, and the promised prosperity of Western-style democracy seemed elusive. However, Hungary succeeded in establishing functioning democratic institutions, joining NATO in 1999, and beginning the process of European Union accession that would be completed in 2004. Viktor Orbán emerged as a dominant figure in Hungarian politics, initially as a liberal democrat but gradually shifting toward nationalist conservatism. After serving as prime minister from 1998 to 2002, Orbán spent 8 years in opposition before returning to power in 2010 with a mandate to restore Hungarian sovereignty and traditional values. His Fidesz party has since maintained control of Hungarian politics, though not without controversy over restrictions on media freedom, judicial independence, and civil society organizations. Modern Hungary represents both the success and the limitations of the post-communist transition. The country has achieved prosperity and stability that would have seemed impossible under communist rule, with modern infrastructure, a diversified economy, and integration into Western European institutions. Budapest has become a vibrant cultural and economic centre, while Hungary's membership in the European Union has provided access to markets and investment that have transformed the country's prospects. Yet challenges remain that reflect the broader difficulties facing democracies in the 21st century. Questions of national sovereignty versus international integration, traditional values versus liberal modernization, and popular democracy versus elite governance continue to shape Hungarian politics. The country that once helped bring down the Iron Curtain and championed European integration now finds itself in frequent conflict with Brussels over the direction of European development. Hungary's journey from the devastation of World War II through communist dictatorship to democratic prosperity illustrates both the possibilities and the complexities of historical transformation. The country that endured foreign occupation, totalitarian repression, and revolutionary upheaval has emerged as a middle power in modern Europe, though one that continues to grapple with questions of identity and direction that have shaped Hungarian history for centuries. The struggles between independence and security, tradition and progress, that defined Hungary's experience under the Habsburg Empire and the communist system remain relevant in the contemporary era of European integration and global change.